Roxanne, welcome to the H.V.M.N headquarters. And it's really an honor to speak to the world's fastest ascent and descent of Mount Everest. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here.
I think all of us know that Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world, definitely a feat to climb and survive and not die. I mean, unfortunately, I think the day that you summited, folks perished. But it would be helpful to get a sense of what the typical timescale looks like and what you did in terms of climbing and returning back home within 2 weeks. How much of the improvement? How much in, I guess, the standard deviation or the difference? How big was that magnitude?
Yeah, so standard Everest expeditions are usually in the range of about 2 months, anywhere from, maybe 50 days up to 70 days, kind of depending on weather and everything. And that's just how it's always been done, because you have to go and spend a certain amount of time on the mountain acclimatizing to high altitude, and you do multiple rotations up the mountain and come back down and rest and recover and then push further up the mountain and so on and so forth. So most tours will do, 2 or 3 rotations up and down the mountain before they actually make a summit attempt. So that's why it takes so long. And you're, by doing this, mitigating kind of the chances that you'll get altitude illness or cerebral edema or pulmonary edema, things like that can be potentially life-threatening.
So you quartered that time.
Yeah. There have been other groups. And so, for instance, the group that I went with through for logistics is Alpenglow Expeditions, and they operate on the north side from Tibet. And they've kind of pioneered this rapid ascent protocol where they have cut the time essentially in half. So they are doing trips now in 35 days. So all of their members who climb with them get a pre-acclimatization protocol before they even leave wherever they come from, and they use hypoxic tents and essentially kind of pre-acclimate before they hit the mountain, and in that way cut the time in half. And so I contacted them to find out more about this system, and it kind of spun out of control from there, because I'm a big science nerd and I was fascinated with the technology and wanted to try it out. But so we went even more aggressive than that. We were like, well, if it can be done in, a month or so, then why can't it be done in a couple weeks? And that's how we got on this journey. So for folks that might not be aware of the mountain or mountaineering, could you describe, and I think people know of base camp, there's like camps in between the summits and base camp. And I know even getting to base camp, some people, count as an accomplishment because it is still quite high there. And you're describing like the typical protocol. It's not like people, go up to base camp and camp 1, come back down. Can you describe like the typical path? Yeah. So the standard route is traditionally through Nepal. So what happens is people generally go and they'll fly into Kathmandu, and then they'll take a smaller flight into this town called Lukla, which is, I believe it's just below 10,000 feet or so. It's maybe 9,000 feet. And from there, they'll start a trek for about 10 days, which will take them progressively higher up to base camp. And base camp is about 17,000, 17,500. It just depends on the year, because it can, shift a little bit in location. Yeah. And that's where you will essentially start your Everest bid from. So once you get to base camp, you spend a lot of time in base camp. It's like a small village. So there's tents, there's generators. So you have, electricity and things like this here. And then you'll start going up to higher camps. And on the south side, there are usually 4 camps in place. So camps 1 through 4. And then most people will, again, make rotations up. So they'll go up to like camp 2, come back down, rest at base camp, maybe go up to camp 3, come back down, rest at base camp, and then go all the way up to camp 4, and then make a launch at the summit from camp 4. And so, Everest is 29,000 feet, I believe. Camp 4 on the south side, and I could be wrong on this because I climb from the north, but I believe camp 4 on Everest is at about 26,000 feet. I could be a little bit off there. But yeah, so you'll essentially ascend about like 3,000 feet on summit day and then come down to a lower camp. Right. So that's why it does take so long. And on the north side, it's kind of a similar, but you don't have the trek into base camp. So you can actually drive to base camp there. It's about the same height, so about 17,000 feet. Right. So like when I landed, for instance, we drove straight to base camp. And so I got off the plane and was at 17,000 feet the same day. So it's pretty high.
Yeah.
we went up to as high as Camp 2, and then we kind of launched our attempt from there. So because we were on a very short timeline, we skipped camps and just went straight for the summit. So it was a very long summit day on our side, but similar kind of strategy if you were to climb it from the north. There's a base camp and then higher camps.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Again, starting at 17,000 feet, I mean, that's 3 miles up. And I just know that, when people go, skiing and you're on like, Tahoe or something, I mean, that's probably what, like 5,000 to 8,000 feet up, and people get altitude sickness there. So you're double that instantly. Before getting to the technicals of the trek, I think it might be interesting to just step back a little bit and understand a little bit of your backstory and history. I mean, obviously one doesn't just wake up and decide to descend Mount Everest in 2 weeks and make a new world record. How did you get interested initially into extreme physiology, extreme mountaineering, extreme sports? When did you realize you maybe had a talent or interest in this?
It's really pretty funny because I grew up in San Diego, California. So I was a beach kid. My family is not very outdoorsy, and I was kind of, the apple that fell way off the tree. And they still wonder to this day. They're just like, what happened? But honestly, I think the way it started was when I was doing my undergraduate degree and I studied abroad in Peru. I went and did the Inca Trail, and we did a trek to Machu Picchu, which was the first time I'd ever been up to like 14,000 feet. We went through this pass, and, I kind of fell in love with the whole outdoors thing and trekking. And eventually that led to me wanting to do the base camp trek to Mount Everest on the south side. So I went and did the trek to, 17,000 feet through Nepal. And I was there and I looked up and saw Everest, saw the Himalaya, and I was just like, God, this is amazing. I need to be climbing these mountains and not just kind of walking around them. So at that point, I was supposed to come back I was living in North Carolina at the time. I was supposed to come back and do my graduate work there at ECU. East Carolina, sorry. I had a full ride scholarship. I had an assistantship position, and I was all set to start in the fall. This was during the spring. And instead of doing that, I came back, decided to move to Colorado to be near the mountains and start training and climbing, and basically changed my entire life to just focus on this one thing. And it was climbing. I didn't know at that point that I would eventually come back and climb Everest. That wasn't like the plan, but it just kind of progressed from there.
I mean, that's pretty drastic to switch. I mean, you just moved to Colorado. I'm sure you found like a different graduate position. You had to scramble to make that happen, I presume.
Well, I didn't actually have a plan in place. My friend lived there, and so I went and, crashed with her for a little bit, did some digging around, eventually ended up getting a second bachelor's while I was there.
Wow. So you were just, I want to prioritize my climbing skills over your academic path.
And and eventually things fell into place, and I did get my master's degree, albeit it was in Texas, which is kind of a long story. But at the time I didn't really have a plan for my education. I was just like, this is what I need to be doing. Something in me was like, whoa, you need to go and pursue this passion. So I did.
So like Everest wasn't necessarily the goal, but you knew you wanted to be sort of a explorer, climber, mountaineer, and Colorado is a good place to build up a base level of fitness and experience. Yeah,
exactly. I just something within me was like, it's corny, and you hear the quote all the time, like the mountains are calling and I must go, but really that's how I felt. And
that's interesting. Was it any specific mountain? I mean, you said it wasn't necessarily Everest that was calling. It was just any like mountains. I want to climb these things.
Yeah, I was like, what do I need to do to start climbing high mountains? Like I was really fascinated by the high peaks, by the altitude. I had done really well with altitude, and being at base camp, 17,000 feet was the highest I'd ever been. And I felt great physically. And I was like, there's something to this, because a lot of other people, I was looking around at people I was trekking with, and they were getting sick and they felt terrible. And I was like, well, maybe I like have a knack for this altitude thing. And again, I'm kind of this physiology nerd. Going back a few steps, like I was supposed to be studying exercise physiology in grad school. And so, part of me was also fascinated by like, what is the science behind this? How do I adapt better than some other people, and why is that? And so, the nerd in me also wanted to kind of figure out what was happening. And going to Colorado, I was not only at altitude in Denver, that's a mile above sea level, but I had access to 14,000 foot mountains, which you don't really get anywhere else.
So what were some of the intermediate mountains or accomplishments you did?
Yeah, it was kind of just like a gradual build. And I also come from a training philosophy background. Like I've been a personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach, things like that. So I knew, the progression had to make sense. It had to be moderate and you had to, build on skills and things like this. So I started with, the Colorado 14ers, which are essentially mountains that are 14,000 feet. You can hike or walk up. And from there, I went and did Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. So it was 19,000 feet. So again, the highest I'd ever been. Felt great. It's mostly a walk up, a hike. Then next mountain I really started training for was Aconcagua down in South America, which is just under 23,000 feet. So it's the highest you can get outside of the Himalaya.
Okay. And did you have to do like ice picks for that one?
Right. Yeah. So that was the first time I knew I needed to get some kind of like mountaineering skills.
Okay.
And so for that mountain, I did actually go and take a mountaineering course with this group called Alpine Ascent up in the North Cascades. Learned how to use an ice axe and crampons and camp in, glaciers and all of those sort of fundamental skills, walking in a rope team and things like that. So
that step, I feel like is the chasm that most people never cross. Like walking up or hiking up Kilimanjaro, I think obviously it's like the tallest peak in Africa, definitely an accomplishment, but it's a walk up. You can hike up. Mm-hmm. When did you know that you wanted to go and like, okay, I'm going to like figure out how to like do ice picks and ice, I guess, ropes and all that. I mean, that seems like a different level of, okay, like this is going to be like semi-professional level training, right? Like people that do that, it feels like it's definitely crossing the threshold of like, I'm a kind of an amateur fit person that's going to climb up Kilimanjaro on my 2-week vacation.
It's a bit more of a commitment, obviously, like time and financial and all of that. And I think a lot of people who get into mountaineering, either like their family's kind of into it, and so they get skills that way just by knowing people, or their friends are into it, or they grow up in these regions where it's normal to go and climb and, be a little more technical, use ice tools and things like that. But I didn't have that background, and I didn't have those acquaintances, or at least ones that I felt like I could go and learn from and be really safe about it. And so for me, just signing up for a course and going by myself was the easiest way to do it. But yeah, a lot of people aren't going to, make that jump. But I knew I wanted to go higher, and I knew the only way to do it safely was to get some proper skills so that I didn't hurt myself. Okay,
so 23K South America. How many years ago was that?
So that was the end of 2014, and then we summited in January of 2015. Okay. So I started this kind of trajectory of doing one big climb per year. So it started with Kilimanjaro in 2013, and then, Aconcagua the year after that. And then once I was on that path, it was like, oh, well, this is how you do all of the 7 summits, or the 7 highest, you know, peak on each continent. And so I figured, well, you might as well just keep going with that. And so the next one after that would be Denali in Alaska. And that is definitely like not something you mess around with. Like that is a very tough mountain, very harsh conditions. It's a long expedition. It's like 3 weeks on a glacier. You get dropped off by this plane and you're not getting off until the plane comes back for you. So it's a lot of gear. It's super heavy. You're walking over crevasses and you're pulling a sled. So I'm, carrying between my pack and my sled more weight than I actually weigh. So that was definitely one where I had to train my butt off for. And it was after I summited Denali successfully in 2016 that Everest actually, in my mind, became a possibility, because I know a lot of people who had climbed Everest already came to Denali and said, Denali is actually a little bit harder than Everest. So, in my mind, I was like, well, I can maybe do this.
Yeah. I don't have any mountaineering experience, but I've seen some documentaries and stories around Everest and Sherpas. And it sounds like within recent years, it's become more of a tourist destination where folks aren't necessarily training, like building up that years of experience, just having Sherpas essentially pull them up. But it sounded like you were very methodical in terms of building out actual skills and confidence to actually do it properly.
Yeah, it is kind of unfortunate, and there definitely is that stigma of, people go to Everest unprepared and get hauled up by Sherpa and things like that. But yeah, my preparation, I actually I think one of the things I love most about climbing is the preparation part.
Yeah.
And I love training, and I love setting out a plan for myself and executing it perfectly, right? Like very methodical.
Yeah.
And so, training became a part-time job for me, especially for Everest. I was training more than 20 hours a week, and I loved every minute of it.
So 2016 Denali. So what was 17 and what was 18? Because this was obviously 2019.
Yeah. So 2017, I went over to Russia and climbed Elbrus, so the highest peak there. And, that one it's like 18,500. It didn't feel very super challenging compared to, say, Denali.
Yeah. How tall is Denali?
Denali is just over 20,000 feet.
Okay.
So, not the highest. It wasn't higher than Aconcagua, but it's tough because it's, really cold and weather and super heavy, and you're just out on a glacier forever. Elbrus was 2017. And then 2018, I went down. So it's kind of funny. There are a couple of lists of 7 summits, and they differ in this one peak, which is down in the South Pacific. So one list says that it's the highest peak on Australia, which is Mount Kosciuszko, which is about, 7,000 feet. It's a walk up. So I did that. But then there's another list that says, well, no, it's not the highest peak on Australia. It's the highest peak on that,
Region.
tectonic plate.
Yeah.
So it's Karsten's Pyramid, which is in Indonesia, which is a really cool, it's more of a rock climbing route. So it's definitely more technical. So I had to train separately for that. And I did both of them in 2018 because I was like, well, I don't want to be wrong. So I'm going to do both.
Yeah.
But it's definitely like more of a rock climb. And then there's this notch in the ridgeline up to the summit where it's like 2,000 or 3,000 foot drop off. You're on these like wire cables. It used to be a Tyrolean traverse, which is like, if you think of the movie Cliffhanger and he's like pulling himself underneath the wire across, now you just walk over this thin cable, but it's like super sketchy and blowing in the breeze. And it's just like this really thrilling and exciting climb. And that one's about, 16,000, 17,000 feet. But so I did both in 2018, and that was down in the South Pacific, but really cool.
So you don't have any fear for heights?
Oh, sure I do. I do, but you just like, I don't know. People ask me a lot. They're like, how do you deal with some of these things? Like, we'll talk about the Everest climb, and there's this really crux part that's called the second step that's super horrifying. I don't know. I get to the worst part of a climb, and for some reason, like, I just like my mind shuts off and I just act and I just move. So, yeah.
Fascinating. I mean, that it's interesting to shut down that primal fear in terms of like phobias or just like your physical danger. And I think it's like easy for us to sit here and intellectualize. Oh yeah, like you just take a step. Like you just imagine you're on sea level, but there does seem to be an animal instinct when you're like super far up that you just cannot control. But it sounds like you either figure out how to control that, or your response to that height is muted compared to other people. Do you think it's a combination of both, or you trained it up?
I don't think I'm the type of person who's just fearless. I really don't. And I think I do have a normal amount of fear of heights. So I think it's something like I did actually use some mental training strategies leading into Everest, visualization techniques, and I would look at this part in the route, which I knew was going to be kind of the most challenging part, the scariest part. And so I mentally prepared so that when I got there, I was like ready to go for it. But
interesting.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. So we're up until the Everest climb. And I want to talk about how you prepare and how you train for it. I mean, obviously, I think when you talk about preparation, there's the nutrition component is obviously one massive lever, and then the training component is probably the second, if not more important, but equally important lever. And then there's probably different little technological hacks. I know you've done, you're mentioning hypoxic sleeping and all of that. So let's walk through each of those big categories of preparation. But before entering that, I mean, why was 2019 the time? I mean, it sounded like you were making your way methodically through each continent, checking off the peak of that continent. Obviously, you're starting to run out of continents by 2019. Was it just getting confidence through your previous experiences that 2019 was the year that you're going to do Everest? Sounded like there was an opportunity to do this lightning ascent that was fairly timely. How that world record attempt for your first Everest climb come together?
Again, I had been on this trajectory of about one mountain per year. And so, 2019 was going to be the year for Everest. And why I didn't do Antarctica first, actually, Antarctica is a lot harder and a little bit more expensive to get to be quite honest. So I was like, well, let's just go for Everest in 2019. And I didn't have a plan of trying to do like a lightning ascent or set a world record or anything like that. I was just going to go and climb it, doing kind of a standard protocol. And I started working at the company I'm with now, GU Energy Labs here in Berkeley, in 2017. And when I started working there, I was doing research on training for high altitude races because I was working with some of our athletes who, train and compete in these races, like in Leadville and things like that. And we installed a hypoxic chamber in our gym at work. And so that kind of got my wheels spinning, and I started using the hypoxic chamber to train for different mountains. So I was also climbing kind of other mountains at the same time as like checking these mountains off my list. Like I would go down to South America and do some high volcanoes down there. And so I decided to start using the hypoxic chamber to cut the amount of time I needed to be, on expeditions. And so that's what kind of started this whole idea of doing Everest faster, because I was finding that I could do other high peaks faster, like anywhere from 19,000 feet up to just under 23,000 feet. We did this climb down in South America, Ojos del Salado. So did that in like 5 days, which normally takes about 15 to 18. And so I was thinking, like, if I can do this, then, I can at least do Everest in like half the amount of time. Why not? Right. And so anyways, that's how we got to Everest in 2019. And I learned about Adrian Ballinger and Alpenglow, that they were already kind of doing this technique on the north side. And so I contacted him, and he told me he was looking for somebody to try a 14-day, that he thought it could be done. And
because they were doing 35 days?
They were doing 35 days at the time, very successfully for a few years. Yeah. And at first I just kind of like laughed it off. I was like, yeah, you're crazy. Like, good luck finding somebody. That was the end of the conversation. And I thought about it for a few days, and, the nerd in me was just like, I wonder if it can be done. Like, that would be so cool from a physiology perspective, like just to see what happens to the human body if you try and do something that aggressive. So I call him back and I'm like, well, what do you think about me? Like, I could maybe do this. And he was like, yeah, why not? You've already like done, similar things on other high peaks. And yeah, absolutely. And so that's how we decided on the lightning ascent. And yeah, it was terrifying. And I had no idea if it would work out. And honestly, I thought maybe we had a 10 to 30% chance of success going into it. Legitimately, that's what I thought our chances were.
What was the previous fastest ascent?
The previous fastest ascent was another gentleman who had worked with Adrian, and he had done both Choyu is another 8,000 meter peak nearby, Choyu and Everest in the same season, but he had climbed, I think it was 24 to 28 days. Okay. So that was kind of like the nearest bar that had been set. So this was very, very aggressive.
So it's almost having the previous world record in terms of speed.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. Incredible.
Yeah.
So you touched upon hypoxia training. That's a super interesting training paradigm. Can you describe what was your protocol there? I mean, would you sleep in this hypoxic tent? Would you do workouts? Would you run on a treadmill in this hypoxic chamber? Did you try to stay in that chamber for, bring your computer in there and work on your laptop in there? How long, what'd you do with it?
Yeah, so we were very fortunate to have the hypoxic chamber installed. So we worked with this company called Hypoxico, and they've been doing this in various facilities. They have them in like gyms and things now. Yeah. So we had one installed in our gym at work at GU, and it's basically like the size of a laundry room, right? So it's not very big. It's see-through plexiglass, so you're in there and it feels like you're in a fishbowl, and it goes up to about 12,000 feet. So I started with that, and I would spend, maybe 4 hours a day in there working. I had a stand-up desk with my computer. You could do workouts in there. But, I knew that wasn't enough. I needed to get as much time as I could in simulated altitude. So I contacted them, and they set me up with a tent system that I could take home and put on my bed. So it really is like your bed goes inside the tent, and then you're in a bubble while you're sleeping, and it simulates hypoxia by condensing the nitrogen content of the air. So there's less oxygen in the air while you're sleeping. So I would try to spend a minimum of 8 hours a night sleeping in hypoxia.
Which simulated altitude?
It could go anywhere from, I would start out gradually at like 5,000 feet, so the height of about Denver, Colorado. And then by the end, I was sleeping up to 20,000 feet. So I wanted to get at least above base camp, equivalent. And you can definitely feel it. And it absolutely impacts, your sleep and your life and your social situation, whatever it may be. Luckily, I'm single, so it's not a big deal.
Folks come home, it's like, oh, what's wrong with your bed?
But yeah, I was trying to get between the tent and the chamber at work a majority of my day in simulated altitude. So, at least 12 hours a day, I would be in a hypoxic environment. And it's kind of like living in a bubble or a fishbowl. And yeah, that was my life for 3 months before I left.
Wow. Fascinating. So typically in hypoxia, you see decrements in cognitive performance. Obviously, recovery slows down. You're just not fueling your body with it, the expected amount of oxygen. So in that 3-month ramp up period, I mean, did you feel more sluggish at work? Did you feel like your day-to-day life was impacted, or did you feel like you adapted to that norm? And obviously some ramp up period, but you felt like work performance, physical performance as you're kind of training and working out was recovering pretty quickly?
I definitely felt the side effects of it, especially as I got into sleeping at some of the higher altitudes. So I'd say above 14,000 feet simulated altitude, I could start to feel a difference in cognitive performance. Like I just would have a little bit harder time finding the right word. For instance, like a little bit slower in my thought process. I would be a little bit more fatigued during workouts, it seemed. But I had done this all before, right? So I had done this for other climbs. And so I kind of knew what to expect. So this time I wanted to get ahead of the game. And so I was really strategic with my nutrition and supplementation protocol to do everything I could to not only support recovery from my really hard training schedule, but to also support cognitive performance. And that was something I really wanted to focus on. So I was planning on collecting data on the mountain specific to cognitive function. And that's kind of how you and I got in touch, is because I knew about the research around ketone esters. I had also been following a ketogenic diet for the previous 4 years leading into this whole expedition. So I knew some of the benefits and the supposed benefits for cognitive performance. And so at that point, I not only was eating a diet that kind of supported recovery and cognitive function, but I also started supplementing with ketone esters.
Cool. Yeah, let's talk about nutrition. But before then, I know that as you're doing the climb, you're wearing this very sophisticated technical suit that's tracking all your biomarkers. I'm curious, heading into the training, were you tracking heart rate variability, other markers as you're doing the ramp up period into the actual attempt?
Yeah, absolutely. So with some of the previous climbs, we had started using this app, H.V.M.N for training. So I always use that like every morning to track my heart rate variability and see, where I might need to recover a little more before a hard workout and things like that.
So did you see your HRV start compressing as you were going higher and higher in altitude? And then did you feel like, did that ever recover down to baseline as you got more acclimatized?
Yeah. So it definitely, like my HRV status definitely declines with, increases in altitude that I'm sleeping at.
Right.
So I could always see that no matter what, with each trip that I'd be using the hypoxic tents. And then when you actually get to real altitude, like it's suppressed even further, right? So your score is just not so great.
So it doesn't recover. You don't see some acclimatization where your HRV starts, climbing back to normal.
Not really, because I'm always progressively pushing the altitude a little bit. And then when you get to actual altitude, you get, not only the hypoxic stimulus, but you also get a hypobaric stimulus, right? So decreased pressure, which is another additional stress on the body. So like that pushes it even a little further into like a stress response mode. But yeah, so heart rate variability, I've been tracking for a long time. I track glucose both with a continuous glucose monitor at times. And then also I use like the little handheld. I'll track my ketones and my glucose.
Interesting.
And then I also...
How does altitude affect glucose metabolism?
Yeah, it definitely upregulates the amount of carbohydrate you're burning. And so it can definitely mess with your glucose levels. And so, sometimes you'll see like a higher fasting glucose response and things like that. Generally for me, mine stays pretty stable, but I also have been on like a low carb diet for a long time.
Yeah.
And so my glucose levels are super stable. Even I'm wearing like the continuous glucose monitor, and I'll even eat things strategically or take things strategically to see if it'll spike my glucose levels,
Right.
but it really doesn't. Like I'm really pretty stable.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like rock solid at around what? I'm just curious in terms of like 80 milligrams per deciliter or...
Fasting
Yeah.
or, I mean, it'll be like in the high 70s and as high as maybe like 85 if
Okay.
I'm not recovered or something like that. Yeah. Like it's pretty stable.
Yeah, interesting. And then what are your ketone levels when you're, I mean, that's like decently low glucose levels.
Yeah. I mean, normally I think my fasting glucose levels are anywhere from like 0.6 to, 2.
Or
So,
ketones, fasting ketones.
Fasting ketones.
Okay.
Yeah. So just
So
kind of
you're
every
like
day.
nicely solid in nutritional ketosis.
And
Cool.
I eat a decent amount of carbs for someone who does a low carb diet. Like
Right.
I'll eat 100 grams of carbs a day sometimes,
Yeah.
and mostly vegetables, but yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you're burning so much calories. Like, I think that's like one thing that folks that are maybe less sophisticated on a ketogenic diet don't realize is that if you're expending that much energy, you can maintain ketosis when you're, ramping up some carbohydrate. And it's probably smart to do so.
Absolutely.
To not start, burning actual lean muscle tissue.
That and like I've been experimenting on myself for a long time, like N-of-1 stuff, but I work for a company that makes carbs for sports,
Yeah.
So I've experimented with up to taking in, 300 grams of carbs during a really long run. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm out there for like 5 hours on the trails, and I'll bounce back right into nutritional ketosis within a couple hours afterwards. So,
let's talk about nutrition. I mean, obviously you have a tremendous background with GU. Obviously you've experimented a lot with ketone esters that, from our company. And it sounds like you've done ketogenic diets for the last 4 years. So did you change your diet? I mean, what, in terms of a ketogenic diet, obviously some folks are doing more carnivorous versions of that. It sounds like we talked a little bit beforehand. That's a little bit scary for you. I'm curious in terms of like your makeup of a ketogenic diet, and did you change it for the Everest protocol?
Yeah, so I started messing around with lower carb diet in 2014, and then I went like full keto probably by like 2015, and then followed a pretty strict ketogenic diet up until 2017, I'd say. So aiming for less than like 50 grams of carbs per day. And then I started working at GU, which is like the opposite, right? Like I was surprised they hired me because I was like fully transparent with them when they were interviewing me. I was like, I follow low carb lifestyle. Like I don't do carbs. You guys make carbs. Like, are you sure you want to hire me?
Yeah.
But they did. So anyways, I start working for them in 2017.
And what was the initial goal for keto? Just performance, endurance, or body comp, or longevity, health span?
I think it was a combination of longevity. I have a family history of diabetes, and I was just a little bit concerned about that, and also body composition. And at the time, I was doing mostly weight training, and so I wasn't doing a ton of cardio. And so I didn't feel like I needed all the extra carbs, So I was like, well, I mean, let's give it a shot and see how I feel. I was working at a company called Muscle Farm at the time in Denver, and met some brilliant researchers there, Jordan Joy, who does a lot with ketogenic diet. And he's the one who kind of got me started on that. So I was like, I'll try it, science, sure. N-of-1, absolutely. And I felt great on it. And it was easy for me to kind of adhere to. And so it just made sense for me for a long time. So anyways, coming back, 2017, I start working at GU, carb company, and I start getting more into endurance and then ultra endurance, right? So really long trail runs, trail races, things like that. So I'm out there for hours on end, and I'm like, I need to be taking in some carbs. You just do. And so my diet did change a little bit. I started eating more on like the vegetable side. So, I did start eating more carbs overall, but they were generally from vegetable sources. And so that was kind of the diet that I rolled into training for Everest with. So it's a really high protein. I really do strategize protein primarily because I want to recover and give my body the amino acids it needs to rebuild itself. And so I'd say it's a high protein, high fat. So probably around 50% of calories come from fat. And, maybe 20% of my calories tops are coming from carbs, but mostly vegetables, some fruit, not a lot, mostly just berries. But yeah, that was kind of what I started with going into Everest. I did change it a little bit because I wanted to focus really on antioxidant defense systems and things like that. So I started strategically trying to get more cruciferous vegetables in, lots of berries, dark chocolate, one, because I love it, but, also like polyphenols and things like that. So I was very specific in that approach. I started eating more fermented foods, focusing on gut health.
Like kimchi, natto.
Yep, absolutely. Like kimchi and sauerkraut, I pretty much eat one or both every day. I love it.
Yeah.
And we we'll ferment our own things. Like we'll make kombucha at work. We'll make our own kimchi and ferment hot sauce.
I want to make kimchi. That sounds fun.
Yeah. So all about the fermented foods, focusing on gut health, not only just for, digestive issues, but also for what it can do for your brain and cognitive function and things like that.
And how about your fat and protein sources? What were you primarily focused on there?
So I started eating a lot of salmon and tuna. So I'll probably have one or the other every day, really trying to get some omega-3s, again, helping with inflammation and brain function. I try to nowadays, and when I was doing full keto, I was eating a lot more red meat and even things like bacon and stuff, as a lot of ketoers will do. But nowadays, I've really kind of moved away from that, not because I think it's bad per se, but I just have started focusing more on like seafood and poultry and eggs and things like that. So that's primarily where I'm getting my protein from. I'll try to get like 30 grams in each meal. I always do a post-workout recovery protein, and that's generally going to be like a whey hydrolysis. So my master's research was on different protein sources and how they're digested, absorbed, and utilized by the body. And whey protein hydrolysis is, by far superior uptake in my mind. Yeah, quickest uptake.
Versus like casein or
okay. Yeah, so it's fast absorbing, and because it's already partially digested, essentially, it crosses the intestinal barrier faster than fully intact protein. So even faster than just like a whey isolate, And there are bioactive components to some of these peptides, these little shorter amino acid chains that are broken down that confer health benefits beyond just, helping rebuild tissues like, things with hypertension and just all sorts of things. So hydrolysis are fascinating. And that's, again, what I did my master's work on. So very partial to whey protein hydrolysis.
So cool. So you had a seafood heavy ketogenic diet or like a low carb diet coming into the Everest attempt. And then did you change that going into the 3 months ahead of time? Did you start thinking about doing fasted workouts, or did you think about periodizing your nutrition? Because obviously when you're climbing, there's depression of appetite, some of these concerns that happens in hypoxic environments. How did you start varying nutrition as you got closer and closer to the attempt?
Yeah, so really interesting, actually. I started in December working with a group called Uphill Athlete, and one of our sponsored athletes, his name is Steve House, started this company with his coach, who's Scott Johnston. And so I reached out to them. They train all of the best, mountaineers, alpinists, climbers in the world. And I figured if I was ever going to hire a coach, this was the time, right? Like I wanted to have everything in my arsenal so that I could make this successful. And so I reached out to them, started training with them, and they had me do a lot of fasted training. And for me, coming from a, sports nutrition background, working for a sports nutrition company, we make products to eat while you're exercising.
Yeah.
And they're telling me like, okay, go out for 5 hours and don't eat anything. I was just like, what the hell?
Torture. I mean, it's tough. I've done some faster workouts. It's not fun because you're just like, you start tired.
Yeah. But so I did it, I did everything they told me to do. They said jumped, I jumped. And, I got into these fasted workouts and it was gradual. It wasn't like they told me to go run 5 hours fasted the first day. But I actually found that it wasn't bad. I was doing just fine. And
makes sense. I mean, you were keto adapted at the time, right? Eating ketogenic diet. So your fat oxidation was probably just nicely in flow.
But I was amazed at how much better it got, above and beyond just being fat adapted from like being on a low carb diet. Yeah. We have at GU Energy, we have our own physiology lab, which, I have like access to a metabolic cart so you can measure your metabolism, see what kind of calories you're burning, how many calories you're burning, no matter what you're doing. And it's portable, which is really awesome.
So what was your RQ coming in? Or did you do respiratory quotient and start testing your crossover points?
Exactly.
Okay.
So I would test periodically. So I started testing before I was training with them and then at a midpoint and then right before I left. And like the results were mind blowing. Like I was so impressed. Before I was a pretty good fat burner. My crossover was at a good point, pretty far to the right if you're looking at the graph, right? Like it was decent. And I always felt like it should have been better. Okay. Considering I was a low carb diet.
Right. So let's break it down a little bit. So there's that two components. What we talk about with RQ, respiratory quotient, it's the ratio between CO2 expelled and O2 coming in. And that's a good marker for what you're burning in terms of fuel. Right. So 1.0 RQ is carb burning, 0.7 is fat burning. Mm-hmm. So where'd you start off with? And then what'd you end up at?
I think the actual number was something like 0.78 or something. And then by the time I got to the midway point, so this is like March, I test myself. Yeah. It was 100% fat burning. So I was at like 0.7. Sometimes it would go below 0.7. Yeah. And I was just like, is the cart broken? Like, what is happening here? So even up to a really high intensity. So we would do this ramp protocol where I'd be walking on a very steep incline at a steady pace, but we would just keep ramping it up. And I would get up to, 21% maybe during a normal test. And I've been testing for years because I have access to this, equipment at the lab. By the time I was at the midpoint, I was adding levels to the test because I was like still 100% fat burning. You know what I mean? Like I was just like, I'm not even tired yet. Like what is happening?
Incredible.
Yeah.
So the crossover point is typically when you go from fat burning to lactate burning, which is typically a way to measure VO2 max, and then some percentage of that is when you start seeing some crossover point. So it sounds like your crossover point to VO2 max is basically...
I didn't hit a crossover point.
Okay, so your VO2 max is still 100% fat burning, basically.
Well, it wasn't 100%, but it was like, so the crossover, you're burning 50-50.
Right.
So when you hit that crossover point, your body is burning 50% of its calories from carbs, 50% from fat, and then it goes exponentially higher into carbohydrates the higher the intensity you push. Right. So I never actually hit a crossover at that midpoint test, and I was just like, at 25% incline, because we have a treadmill that goes up to like 40%, like straight up basically. Yeah. And I was just like, okay, well, I guess test is over.
You felt like you were at 100% effort or close as 100% as possible.
It was close. My heart rate was at like 183 or something like that. Like it was pretty high,
So that's fascinating. So you're basically like, it was like maximal load and you were still predominantly fat burning.
Yeah.
It's cool. Yeah. Very cool.
So really cool results from the fasted training. That's what I attributed it to. And also it's just being fitter. I got so much fitter. When I went into the training with them in December, I had spent the entire summer that year running ultra marathons like every 3 to 5 weeks. Yeah. I was just, trying to get a big aerobic base because I knew I'd be training with them and I wanted to be super fit. Right. So I thought I was pretty fit going into it. But I got so much fitter training with them. I just couldn't even believe it. And so a large component of how much fat you're able to burn as an athlete is actually just your aerobic training status. So just being fitter makes you a better fat burner. There are things like, you get more mitochondria, so you have a greater capacity to burn, like more, factories to burn fuel in. So all of these things kind of contributed to it. But I think the fasted training, not only did it make me a better fat burner, but in the end, saved my butt. Like, I'll get into that story later, but yeah, it was, I'm really glad that they did it that way.
Yeah. So you mentioned ketone esters and other supplements. So how did ketone esters incorporate into your routine? What did other supplements? I imagine were you strategic using carbs, goo stuff, other people's stuff? I mean, how did all the other things come into play here?
Yeah, so I definitely see carbohydrates as like a strategic supplement. So for instance, goo products I would use kind of strategically if I was doing a high intensity workout, maybe taking like a gel or something before something really intense, things like that, where I know I'm going to have to tap into, carbohydrate burning. So definitely using goo products during the training. If you walked into my house, you would see there's just like a whole shelf of supplements because I've been doing supplement research for a long time. That's been kind of my area of specialty. So I'm always looking for what can help with recovery, what can help with performance. And the ketone ester specifically, I had started using. One of our athletes, Jeff Browning, was actually who introduced me to you all. Yeah. He was using goo products and ketone esters. And at first, the marketing team and the group that oversees kind of our elite athlete program, they came to me and they're like, well, if it is okay if Jeff uses the H.V.M.N? Like, is that a competitive product? And I was like, no, I don't see it as a competitive product. Like, even the way you guys talk about it is like, yeah, use the ketones, but also use carbs along with it because it'll actually drop your blood glucose levels. So I was like, no, it's totally fine. And then I really wanted to talk to you guys anyways. So that's how we started our relationship. But I knew that it would put you into a rapid state of nutritional ketosis. And I was already always kind of in nutritional ketosis, so I didn't feel like I needed it for that purpose, but mostly for the cognitive things we've already talked about, but also for recovery. And then that paper came out about how
Peter Hesbel in Belgium,
can help with, offsetting some of the overreaching symptoms and things like that. And I was like, well, I'm training my butt off. And so I absolutely should try this for recovery as well. And so I did. So I'd start using it strategically even after workouts to kind of promote recovery and prevent overreaching. But I really wanted to use it on the mountain for the cognitive effects. And so that's why I came to you and asked if I could, bring it up Everest essentially and do some testing with it. And I really feel like it makes my brain just work better at altitude. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think we have some actual unpublished data there. I mean, I think it's a paradigm that's super interesting, like the cognitive performance aspects of ketone esters. So I'm curious to get a sense of, maybe talking about the nutritional component up your Ascent. You mentioned something about being super fat adapted was important. Like, I want to hear that story. And then two, would be interesting in terms of, what was that cognitive effect, or what was your subjective experience with ketone esters or other products on the Ascent?
So I'm very fortunate in that I work with research and development at GOO. And so basically anything that I can dream up in my mind, almost anything, they can at least help me kind of put together a rough prototype of it in the lab that we have. And so for Everest, I actually did come up with a bunch of custom products for nutrition. So we came up with a custom Everest bar, which is a very calorie dense, but predominantly fat. So it was a lot of like coconut butter, macadamia, cacao.
Sounds pretty good.
It was delicious. Oh my God, it was so good. So we came up with a custom Everest bar. We came up with a custom drink mix kind of based on our Roxanne line, which is carbohydrates and electrolytes and amino acids, so protecting your muscles as well, but also adding ketone salts to that. Basically, I was looking to put ketones anywhere I could get them, in addition to, using the ester. And then we also did a custom gel with some added ketones to that. So all of these things I took up the mountain. Again, I was very fat adapted, so I knew I could handle a decent amount of fat, even though at altitude you tend to shift more into a carbohydrate burning state. It's a more efficient fuel source than burning fat. So you just kind of do, your body prefers it. So I was definitely doing carbs like in the drink mix and the gel, but I had this bar that when I was moving kind of slowly between camps, I'd be carrying 35, 40 pound packs. So you're not moving super fast. And at altitude, you're, one step, one breath. It's slow progress. But so yeah, I took all these custom products up there to test, and those worked out really well. I took the ketone esters, so I was taking about 1 or 2 bottles a day. And so I would just kind of I was actually dividing the bottle up. So I was taking like partial doses as I was moving throughout the day. So I'd take, maybe 10 grams at a time. If you look at the little markers on the bottle, I'd take about 10 grams at a time while I was moving. And subjectively, I would take that and feel like I could just think more clearly. I did notice, I hit base camp at 17,000 feet and we walked up to 23,000 feet before we started using oxygen. And as I got progressively higher, it was like things slowed down. And above, I guess, maybe 19,000 feet, I started feeling like I was walking in a dream, or I was like outside my body watching myself walk, or like things were in slow motion. Right. So, I would take the ester and feel like things got a little bit more clear, a little bit more sharp, like colors seemed less muted, things like that, You
went behind your eyeballs again.
Yeah. So
you weren't playing a third person RPG anymore.
It's wild. It really feels like you're just outer body.
Yeah.
So, I did all this subjective kind of, analysis of it. And I was like, wow, this is really helping. And even I was with my guide, Lydia Brady, who's the first woman to ever summit Everest without oxygen, super badass lady. I gave her a bottle to try and she was just like, wow, this is incredible. Like, I feel really sharp right now. We're
nice.
Sitting there at like 20,000 feet. I have a video of it. It's pretty funny. She's just like, this is awesome. I'm like, yeah, I know. It works. But I did take this cognitive function test system with me, which is like, it almost feels like you're playing little brain games. Like if you've ever done like Lumosity or whatever that app is. So you can test reaction time and decision making and things like that. So I did take that up the mountain. Unfortunately, it only made it to about 21,000 feet advanced base camp before it started kind of getting a little wonky on me. I think it didn't like the cold and the altitude so much. But, we have that data. And so it'll be interesting to look at it once we have the analysis in, how that actually reflects when I took the ketone ester versus when I didn't and what altitude we're at. So that'll be exciting.
Yeah. I mean, it's super cool subjective experience. I mean, were you in terms of objective measures? Sounds like you had the cognitive tasks to track. Were you targeting a level of ketosis as you were going up the mountain, or was it just? I mean, I don't know if you were like wanted to finger stick yourself at like 25,000 feet up in the mountain, but was that something that you were targeting or something that you were tracking?
I wouldn't say I was like targeting anything in specific. Going into it, I was like super ambitious. I'm like, I'm going to collect all this data. I'm bringing all this equipment. Like I did bring my handheld ketone meter, like the Keto Mojo. So I was looking at ketones and glucose and hematocrit and hemoglobin. Right. But yeah, as I got higher, I was just like, I don't want to keep sticking myself. I got to just do this. I don't want to carry it up there with me. So, but yeah, I would be in sustained nutritional ketosis for the most part when I was testing. And like, obviously when I was taking the ketone ester, I think I have a picture where it's like 3 millimolar, 3 point something. So yeah, and I always felt better when I was right after taking the ester versus like not taking it. Then I would feel a little bit more foggy and things like that. And then you get to 23,000 and you put oxygen on. And so you're just like, wow, colors are real. Like snozzberries taste like snozzberries. Like things are great. So yeah, then it kind of all shifted once you get oxygen on, but
cool.
Yeah.
And then we touched a little bit about fasted training. Any other specific techniques that you were implementing? Were you doing, I don't know, high intensity interval training? It sounded like you were doing some visualization across certain important passes. Anything else in terms of interesting techniques or tips or best practices for our listeners?
Yeah, around the time I started working with, the fasted training and working with the coaches. And so they had me doing a lot of these like muscular endurance workouts, which are both, in a gym setting, there's like, it's plyometric based, you're wearing a weight vest. So it's getting your legs used to taking like an eccentric load, essentially. Like it really hurts after the fact. It's the kind of workout that you get really sore from. So that was some of my training, and then doing really heavy loaded carries up and down hills. So like 1,000-foot hill. And I was in Mammoth for the last 3 weeks before I left to get actual altitude. I found like this couloir. So it's like a snow gully. And I was basically just making laps up and down. That was 65 pounds. It was like
on a backpack?
Fest. Yeah.
So you're just like rucking.
Exactly. So lots of that
65 pound ruck up 1,000 feet mountains or hills.
They'd be like, all right, go for 2 hours. I'm like, okay. And like a stair machine a lot of times.
That's badass. I mean, that's tough. Like
it wasn't easy.
Top end military level. I mean, that's 65 pounds a lot.
It's more than half my body weight.
You're not a big person. I mean, you're not a huge person. I mean, that's crazy.
I know. I would check with them. I'm like, really, guys? Like, we're doing 65 today? Like, yeah, go get it, Tiger. I'm like, oh, okay.
I'm just like thinking like some of the special operators are probably doing like 50-pound rucks. I mean, and those are big dudes.
And the thing is, on Everest, like, you're not carrying that much weight ever. This is just to make me tough as nails, and it worked. Like, I felt bulletproof. And, when I wasn't in the mountains, I would have to do stuff like that on stairs, like at a gym, which was, oh my God, I can't tell you how much time I spent on that stair machine. They actually put a sign on it at one point, probably about a month before I left, and it said, please limit your use to 1 hour at a time. Thank you. And I was like, that's
for
definitely
you.
Me.
Yeah.
It's definitely me.
So were you just like wearing like a 65-pound ruck, just like on that Stairmaster for like 3 hours?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure people just thought I was insane.
I just picturing it. Just this lady in the corner with half her body weight on her back, just like on there for 3 hours straight.
People started coming up and asking me, they're like, what are you training for? Because you're training for something, obviously. And I'd be like, oh, just a mountain, like some mountain I'm climbing. I don't want to give it away. But okay, so aside from the training, one thing I implemented with all of this Everest, lead up was intermittent fasting and just time restricted feeding. So being really strategic about that, and I got the Zero app to kind of track my fasting, and I wasn't doing anything super aggressive, but I wanted to shut it down at least 12 hours a night was my goal. So like a 12-hour every day at least. Yeah. And then on my kind of recovery day, I would do like more of a 18 to 22-hour fast. Yeah. So just using that as a way to give my system time to repair itself, essentially. So, and I still do that now. I really enjoy it. Yeah. But I was eating dinner at like 5 o'clock at night every night.
Yeah. I mean, you're also, that means when you're eating, you're probably eating a lot at a time. I mean, because you're doing you said like around 20 hours a week of training, and this is like very heavy training, and you're constricting your eating window. So I'm sure you had like pretty big meals.
I mean, I would try to get the calories in on days when I would have like a 5-hour feeding window. It was tough, you know. I would just be like, I don't know if I can get, a couple thousand calories in even. Exactly. So in the process, whether it was from, this is still open to debate, whether it was from the training, whether it was from the time restricted feeding or whatnot, I lost 20 pounds. And again, I was never a big person ever. Like, I maybe started at like 130.
Got down to 110.
Yeah. And, but the craziest part is, right? So when you lose weight, generally about 25% of weight loss comes from lean mass. Yeah. So from like muscle, right? Or connective tissue. Yeah. 95% of my weight loss was fat. I lost only 1 pound of muscle out of 20. Wow. And I strongly suspect that it was, not only like diet and being fat adapted and the fasted training and all of that, but I think it was also some of the hypoxia. So living in the tent and the chamber does things. And I've been looking into this research. Now I'm going into my PhD work, but seeing how hypoxic environments actually upregulate fat burning.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it was really fascinating.
Some growth hormone or something to retain the lean muscle tissue. Some response to the hypoxic environment probably as well. Yeah. So that's definitely an area of research that I'm super interested in now. And we'll see. Man, so you were just like a super ripped, lean, super strong, like person, just powering through tons of workouts and like eating massive meals when you're eating. Yeah, it was crazy. So I mean, were you worried about injury? I mean, in terms of overreaching, that's like you're pushing your body hard. Right. And I mean, I got down to, I was also measuring via DEXA scan, my body composition and everything like that.
Again, I didn't really lose any muscle, which was awesome because I needed
what body
it.
fat percentage were you, like 10? Like,
No, for women, it's a little different, right? So women
yeah.
have 12 to 13% is essential fat. You need that, or you can't reproduce and things like this.
Right.
I got down to 15, so it was super lean. And even my coaches were like, "Go eat a hamburger, like for real. Like you need to eat some more." But yeah, so the leanest I'd ever been, the fittest I'd ever been, like the best fat burning I'd ever experienced. Everything was like, it was like all systems go, and I was ready, right? And the thing is, like, the way I was doing this attempt, you have to wait for the weather to be right before you head out. And you don't want to mess that up because, then you're not going to get this 2-week, door-to-door ascent.
Right, there's a storm up there, then you got to wait it out, and you're just stuck.
Right. So I'm fully trained and I'm ready to go. And I'm like, I need to get out there.
Right.
And Adrian and Lydia, my guide, were already on the mountain, right? So they're in Tibet. And they get out there in mid-April, I believe. And my departure window tentatively was set for like May 1st. So May 1st rolls around and I'm ready to go. And I'm like sitting here in Berkeley. I'd been in Mammoth for 3 weeks just to like get some actual altitude. I came back ready to go. Bags are essentially packed. I mean, all my stuff is like on the floor when I say essentially packed. But, and they're just like, the weather is really bad here. Like things are not looking great.
Yeah, I remember we were talking or trading emails back and forth, and it was like you were just waiting. Like, okay, weather's not good, and I'm just kind of twiddling my thumbs, waiting.
Terrible.
Right.
The worst, just like sitting there, and I'm like trying to be at work and be focused and like, do my thing. But I'm also trying not to like go crazy with training because I have to be ready to go at a moment's notice.
Yeah, did you taper? I mean, I guess you just kind of were tapered off. You're like, okay, I'm going to just like recover as much as I can.
Yeah. So my coaches were like, well, you're scheduled to leave anytime now. So we're not going to do anything super aggressive, but you need to stay trained. So we just did some maintenance work and things like that. But it was the hardest. I ended up waiting until I flew out May 10th, but like 10 days of just kind of sitting there and waiting for the call to like get on the plane or
longest week and a half ever.
Book my ticket. Like I didn't even have a flight booked. You know what I mean? I was just like, what if they call me and I can't get a flight? Like, what are we going to do? And I missed the weather window and then this doesn't happen. Like, God forbid there wasn't a weather window. That was also something I was worried about. I was like, what if we just don't get one?
Yeah.
So.
Well, you're still super fit and jacked, so.
Yeah. Just go do like a bikini competition or something. I don't know.
So let's talk about the actual summit day, because I think it was actually a very interesting day on the mountain. A lot of our listeners and folks probably saw that viral Mount Everest photo where you had this giant queue of people up until summit. And I believe, I think you mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, like, someone died on the mountain that day as well. So that made headlines around the world, and you actually summited that same day, but on the completely opposite side of the mountain, and you were alone. Walk us through that story and what that day was like. I mean, like the emotional side as well as, the technical side.
Yeah. It's wild because I didn't know about any of that stuff that happened on the south until after I came down. But the day that picture was taken with the crazy lineup, that was the day I summited, but from the north. And so, our summit attempt was, we again were having really bad weather. Even when I got there, the weather had shifted. We were anticipating a summit day of around May 20th. Which is why I flew out on the 10th. And then by the time I got there, things had changed and they were looking more at like a May 24th, May 25th window. And I was like, crap, there's no way this like 2-week thing is happening. Might as well just like get set in, get comfortable. Right. I'm going to be out here for like 16, 17, 18 days. Who knows if we get a window, because it was like super windy, super cold. And because of that, the Sherpas who generally go up and fix the route, which means they put lines up so that if you slip and fall, you don't go like off the mountain entirely. They hadn't been able to get up to the top. And on the south, they had already fixed the lines somewhere around May 14th. So people were able to summit before that. But on the north side, they weren't up. So nobody can climb, without those being in place. And, we were like, this isn't going to happen. So we start moving up the mountain just because we want to be ready and in place when May 24th, 25th rolls around. We get up to Camp 2, which is at about 25,000 feet. So, 4,000 feet below the summit. And generally people will go up to at least Camp 3 and then make a summit push from there. And sometimes there'll even be a Camp 4 on the north side.
Yeah. So when you make camp, it's like an overnight stay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we get to Camp 2 and we see the possibility that on the 22nd, there might be a small weather window that we could attempt to do if they get the lines put up in time. And the Sherpas were planning on going up and finishing on the 22nd, but prior to that, they had gone up and come back about 5 times unsuccessfully because of really bad weather and high winds. So we weren't sure if they were going to be able to do it. And so, the night we were thinking of whether we should go for the 22nd or not, Adrian gets on the phone because he's at a different camp. Radio. He radios Lydia and I, and he's like, there's a small chance you could get the 22nd. This is the only way you'll be able to do this whole 14-day door-to-door thing. This is the only opportunity you have for that. But you'd have to start late because you need to give the Sherpas time to make it to the summit that they're fixing the ropes. Mm-hmm. I can't guarantee that they're actually going to get there because they've turned back so many times. And, it's going to be a very long day because you have to go from Camp 2 all the way up and then all the way back down instead of hitting Camp 3. So, it's going to be a late day, it's going to be a long day, and you might not be able, you might get up there and they might turn around and you have to come back down, and that will be your only opportunity. Like, there's probably not going to be another chance for you to go back up after this. So if you try this, it's risky, but it's up to you.
It's like a one shot, and the purpose of that is that they don't want you to try like multiple summit attempts.
Basically, you'd have to recover enough time, and then that wouldn't be enough time to make that second push if we tried for like the 24th, 25th.
Because it's so exhausting to push. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, especially from Camp 2.
And then what's the nuance with that late start? I mean, if you end up too late, is it just get too frigid, too windy at night?
Yeah, generally people try and summit around dawn. So 5, 6, 7 in the morning. And the latest, usually there's a hard turnaround for most people climbing at 10 a.m. They want you to be coming back down already because bad weather comes up. Just like on any, It's not for tourist reasons of taking a photo at dawn. It's just it's too dangerous for you to start too late. Yeah, weather deteriorates the later it gets in the morning. So generally, most people will have a hard turnaround of 10, maybe 11 a.m. at the latest. They want you coming back. Yeah. So most of the time, in order to get that kind of time frame, you have to start at 10 o'clock the night before or something like that. In comparison, we started at almost 2 a.m. So very late start by Everest standards.
So how did you even time the sleep? Were you sleeping? I mean, it was just I'm going to try to sleep at 6 and then wake up at 2, or how did that even work? So we had been just consistently moving up and had moved camps the 3 days prior with our packs and everything. So it was 35, 40 pound, pack carries for multiple hours. And so I was actually pretty tired even by the time we got to Camp 2. Yeah. And then we made the call that we were going to go for it. And it was already, 4 in the afternoon by the time we made camp. And so, I knew we had to leave really, really early. We just tried to rest as best we could. I didn't sleep at all the night before the summit. I was just wow. I was too excited. I was too nervous. I just laid there. So in your sleeping bag, just eyes open, being So, and you're in this sleeping bag, but you've got a mask on, so you can't really roll over. And there's people on the other side of me, and I was you're like a little sardine. I was just oh my God, let's go. Night before you go to Disneyland, So before we gloss over it, so talk us through the decision. I mean, obviously this was a big, important decision, potentially life-threatening decision that you had to make a decision on. Was it an easy decision? Was it all right, I have this window, let's go for it? Was it back and forth? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Lydia and I were in the tent together when we got this call from Adrian. Yeah. Again, he was at a different camp. So we're sitting there and we were okay, give us a minute to think about it. And I think both of us knew kind of immediately, we had to give it a shot. Yeah. I had done all this training for this purpose. This was the goal. Not that it had to be done this way, but I was if there's ever a chance to do something that's never been done before, this is it. This is it, yeah. Let's go for it. Yeah. And I just knew we had to do it. So it took us 2 minutes really, and we were just kind of yeah, we're gonna go. Yeah. Was there any consideration of mortality or risk? I think in the back of my mind going into the entire trip, I knew that there statistically was, maybe a 5% chance of dying. Yeah. Maybe a little more just because of the way I was doing it. Yeah. But I had already accepted that at that point. I was eh. Okay, so it's just all right, I already assumed that this is a dangerous activity. I have a window. Let's go. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I didn't think that waiting would be any better of an option. I just figured Right. You're camping up there, being cold and like slowly dying.
Deteriorating.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's
So I was like, let's just go.
Okay. So you start at 2 a.m. You were a sardine wide awake for 8 hours, trying to rest as much as you could. Talk us through summit day.
Yep. So it was myself, my guide Lydia Brady, and 2 climbing Sherpa, Mingma and Pasong. And Mingma is a rock star, and this was his 15th summit attempt. So he was kind of leading the charge, and then Pasong was heading up the rear essentially. So the 4 of us left. Nobody else was climbing that day. Like nobody else wanted to take that gamble. So we were the only ones climbing. There was the rope fixing Sherpa. They were at a higher camp already. So like we knew they were somewhere up above potentially, like we couldn't see them yet. So when we took off, it was just us and it was really kind of peaceful. The forecast was for some decent wind and really cold temperatures. So I wore a bunch of extra layers under my giant down suit that I was wearing.
Yeah. What was temperature? Like negative?
I mean, it was probably like around 0, maybe negative 10 when we started.
Yeah.
It wasn't that bad.
Okay.
And,
wind chill, like windy?
Yeah, there was definitely some wind and I got like some wind burn on the little bits of my face that were exposed. Yeah. But it wasn't as bad as the forecast called for. Okay. So, that comes into play later, but I ended up being way overdressed. So we got up to Camp 3 at about 27,000 feet, maybe like a few hours later. And that's where some of like Adrian and some of his other team were.
And this is a couple hours in. And like, I guess, again, sorry to interrupt here, but like this is the middle of the night. So I didn't really understand that, people are doing this in the middle of the night. So you were headlamps, it's like visibility's low. You're just kind of like making sure you don't like step into a crevasse on accident.
Yeah. So most of the time when you're climbing high mountains, you're getting what's called an alpine start. So you're starting at like, 11 p.m., midnight, something like that. And you're climbing by headlamp for a good portion of the climb.
Okay. So nocturnal climbing is pretty standard then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're climbing through the night. And again, because we started late, we get to Camp 3. It's about 3 hours later. So the sun is starting to come out and we can actually see things, which was really nice. Worked out in our favor because then I only had to wear the headlamp for a few hours. Hit Camp 3 about 3 hours later. Keep going from there, you hit this ridge line, and then you're going basically along this ridge line, which is pretty exposed. That's where like really bad winds can come up. That's where these features are called the steps. The 3 steps are found. So it's like these rock cliffs that you have to scale. And that's a good portion of the route on the north side. And definitely like the most technical part of the climbing on the north side is above 28,000 feet. So when you're kind of at your worst, you have to perform at your best. And that's why a lot of people don't climb the north, right? So to step back for a minute, about 1/3 the amount of climbers attempt from the north versus attempting from the south through Nepal. And there's a few reasons. So 1, they issue permits more freely from the Nepal side, as we've seen. It's a little harder to get permits from the Chinese on the Tibet side. 2, it's a little bit more exposed. So that ridgeline is very exposed. There's not a lot of protection from wind and from cold. So the weather can be a little worse on the north. And 3, it's a little bit more technical higher up. So the worst part of the climbing is when you're at the highest altitudes versus the south.
So you're the most deteriorated and it's the most technical. So it's like a bad combination or a risky combination. Yeah.
So anyways, we hit the ridgeline and we're making pretty good progress. We figured it would be about 9 to 10 hours to get to the summit from Camp 2. And so, we're kind of going along and then we finally see the rope fixers ahead of us. We're like, great. They're making progress. Like, go guys, go,
Yeah, lead the way.
Right. So, and at one point we even kind of stop and like, I think they like sat down to eat something and we're like, okay, we'll just like rest for a little bit. So we give them time to get to the summit. But eventually we get to the 3 steps, which is, these rock cliffs that you have to go up. There's some rickety ladders in place that they put attached by ropes. And you have to climb up those, which is the second step I knew was going to be the hardest part of the climb. And it's maybe a 50-foot or something like that cliff. And there's like 3 ladders that are attached by very precariously placed ropes. And so you're in crampons, you're in this giant down suit where you can't see your feet. Crampons are like spiky metal things that helps you stick to a mountain. And then you're wearing oxygen and you have your pack on with an oxygen canister, so you can't really turn your neck. Like visibility is terrible. Dexterity is terrible. You're wearing big puffy gloves. so it's really kind of just hard to function, right, when you're climbing these ladders. And so we get to that part. That was the part I had kind of in my mind visualized would be the worst part of the climb. Turns out it wasn't. I mean, it was tough, but we get above the second step, and then there's the third step, and that has like just been fixed maybe an hour before we get to it. And there's really not a lot of anchors, which is where an attachment point to the mountain. So just like long expanses of rope that are not anchored to anything. And, some of them are attached, little flimsy rope, like maybe the diameter of your finger, like your index finger. And that's what's keeping you on the mountain in the event that you fall, right?
Yeah.
So we get to the final snow slope to the summit, maybe 500 feet below the summit. The rope fixers had made it up there. We knew they'd finished, so they were actually coming down as we were heading up, and they were surprised to see us. Honestly, like they didn't know that anyone was right behind them. So they come down, and we're going up, and we're putting our weight on this fixed line, and all of a sudden, like the rock anchor it's attached to, which is on the slope up above us, just completely comes out of the snow and like comes tumbling down the slope towards us. And so like not only is our rope loose, but there's this giant rock coming down towards us. And then there's like 10,000 feet of drop off below. If we fall off this thing, like we are going and we're shock loading the line with the four of us on it, and that whole anchor system might blow, So it was a really just intense moment. And we got out of the way of the rock. We like unweighted ourselves from the line, like unclipped, like refixed the rope to something else. But like, after that, I was like, we're the first people to be on these ropes. They just finished. Like, I don't even trust the lines are like safe. Like, what if that happens again? So yeah, that last bit to the summit, I was just like on pins and needles, like thinking that.
That was a jolt.
Yeah.
If you weren't awake, you were definitely, okay, wow.
So that was probably the scariest part of that climb, was just getting to that point and then like feeling like that could have been it for us.
Yeah.
Like that was a game over moment, right? Like if we hadn't gotten out of the way and if we had, So anyway.
Was there a moment where like, I'm done? Like life flashing across your history of life crossing your eyes? Or were you just more shocked? Were you just trying to survive, get out of the way?
Yeah, it was very like animal instinct, just like get out of the way, like move and secure yourself to the mountain, right? Like, so typically you'll self-arrest with your ice axe and like dig your crampons in, the points of your crampons into the snow slope so that you're like stuck to the mountain.
Yeah.
So it was very much that, like training just kicks in and you assume the self-arrest or the rest position.
Yeah.
But yeah, it happened so fast. Like in reality, it was probably a few seconds worth of time, but so anyways, we continue on from there and make it to the summit. And by the time we get there, the rope fixing Sherpas had gone down already. So it was just the four of us.
Yeah.
And we get to the summit and there's nobody else there. And I'm just like, what in the hell? Like, there should be people here, at least from the south side, because I know nobody was behind us on the north. And there was no one. We looked down the south route into Nepal and there was nobody there. And I wasn't even thinking at the time, probably because of hypoxia and being tired, but like it was pretty late in the day, you know, it's almost noon at this point. And by then everybody had come and gone already. But for a moment I was just like, are we in the right place? Am I dead? Like, is this heaven?
Yeah.
Like it's sunny. There's nobody up there. It's just us. It was like this total moment of, Zen, to be pretty cheesy, but it was just like perfect.
That's incredible. I mean, one, you had kind of a near-death experience. When you finally, I guess, crossed that last step, and it was like the final steps up was like a moment of elation, like I'm alive, I'm gonna do it, and then actually being on top of that mountain. What did that? I guess you thought you might have died or been in heaven at that point, but like, what was your? I mean, that's like months and months of hard training to accomplish that last step.
Yeah. It's hard to describe, really. Like, I think I was so tired, and to be quite honest, like, this was the hardest thing I've ever done. Like, I talk about it and it's a short story when you're just explaining out loud, but like I was exhausted the entire day. Like we had been moving with our packs and like by the time we got to Camp 3, that morning, like 3 hours in, I was like, I'm pretty tired. This is going to be a battle. Like my body was physically tired.
Yeah.
And so, the whole rest of that summit day, I was just like fighting fatigue. And the other thing that happened, which I didn't touch on yet, but this was the first time I was ever wearing an oxygen mask on a climb, and so there were things about it that I didn't realize. Like, it's really hard to take off. And if you're wearing, any sort of headgear or helmet or hood or anything, you can't really pull the mask too far away from your face. So it's really difficult to feed yourself, to get food in or drinks in. And, because it was extra effort and because I was so tired, I had all this, custom nutrition and this whole plan in place of like how many calories I'm going to get per hour and how I'm going to do it. I was just too tired to feed myself. And so
it's too awkward to just pull it off.
You could only get like an inch gap maybe between like your mask and your mouth. And so you'd have to like slip food in. And I was just like, I'm too tired. And like, I didn't want to take my backpack off to drink my water. So that whole summit day ended up being
fasted.
Pretty much. Like I got maybe 200 calories in and a half a liter of water in 16 hours. So I was exhausted. We got to the summit and again, I was like, kind of just like, maybe I died or maybe this is a dream, but yeah, it was a tough day. And
so it was almost a relief. It's like, I'm done.
I was like, I'm halfway. I was like, holy crap, this is amazing, but I'm only halfway. And like, we have so much longer to go. And going down, it's
probably harder.
Yeah. Going down any mountain is where most accidents occur, where most people die because they're tired and, they're excited and they just want to get down and they've spent all of their energy getting to the top and they don't save anything for the descent. So in my mind, I'm like already calculating. I'm like, okay, we're halfway. I have to have the energy to get back down. I'm exhausted. I haven't been eating. I haven't been drinking. And I see these clouds building in the distant horizon, not even distant, like they were rolling towards us. And I'm like, the weather is changing and we need to get off this mountain. So like, I enjoyed the summit for maybe 20 minutes before I was like, we got to get out of here. And so
you're a pro. You're already calculating. So, okay. So you got 20 minutes up there.
Yeah.
So you had 20 minutes of, maybe 10 minutes of enjoying it, 10 minutes of planning.
Right. Right. But I was like so tired. I didn't even take off my backpack. I didn't pull out my like banner that I had planned. Like, I was just looking back. I'm like, dang it, I should have done that. But at least Lydia got some pictures of us and stuff like that. But, so then I knew like, you're halfway, you got to get back down and I'm super tired and I'm underfed. But surprisingly, I didn't feel like I was going to bonk. I was just like physically, like my body felt tired, just fatigue, muscle fatigue and things like that.
That would have been terrifying if you felt like you were bonked at the top. It's like, oh my
God, yeah, that would have been scary.
So, okay, so you didn't feel like you were bonked, but you were tired.
Yeah, physically tired. Like things just like clipping and unclipping into the line was just exhausting. Like my fingers didn't even want to work with me. I was just like, oh my God, so much effort right now. But yeah, because of all the fasted training and everything and being so fat adapted, like I never felt like I was going to bonk or like, mental energy wasn't there. So I think that's where the fasted training really saved my butt in this case. So I was very thankful afterwards that we had done so much fasted training. And now I know I have a whole new level of reserve that I didn't even know. If I can do 16 hours on 200 calories, I'm like, shoot.
On top of being calorically deficit and for like all the days before even getting to camp 2. Yeah. So pretty amazing stuff. So that was kind of someday. We went back down. We got to camp 2. By the time we got there, Adrian had wanted us to go all the way down to advanced base camp, which is at 21,000 feet. We got to camp 2 where we had started from that morning. And I was like, this is where we're stopping for the night. It was 4:00 in the afternoon. We'd been on our feet for 16 hours moving. And I was like, this is it. So, I mentioned I had overdressed. So I had sweated through everything I was wearing. Sopping wet.
So I'm wet. And the weather is getting cold, it's turning into night, and I'm like, all this clothing is going to freeze, including my, my technology suit, which is tracking all of my biometric everything. So like pulse oximetry and blood flow and breathing rate. I had to take everything off because it was wet, and then it froze overnight. Anyways, so we sleep for like 4 hours, wake up again. We knew we had to get on our feet and move because now the
clothes were all frozen. You literally had to like break ice off your suit.
No, I mean I ended up putting some of those things just in my pack and then like changing into borrowing some other layers from other people that were like, Anyways, so the clock is ticking. I'm like, we have to get we have to get out of here. Like tomorrow there's going to be a car waiting for us at base camp. Like we have to move. So the next day we get up. It's a really early start, and we have 8,000 feet to descend and like 20 miles or something to get back to base camp. So the next day ends up being another 13-hour day on our feet. Again, underfueled. I didn't really want to stop and eat or like pause because I knew we just had to push. So ended up doing another 13 hours on maybe like, a few hundred calories, something like that. So another long day. We get to base camp. Cars coming for us 2 hours later, 8-hour drive to the airport, 30 hours of travel later. I get to SFO airport 1 hour before the 2-week timeline cut off. And that was it.
That's incredible. And when you finally landed back at SFO, were you just like, wow, did that actually happen? Were you like, yes, I'm a badass. Like, what did it feel like when you're finally done? I mean, it sounded like it was probably just nonstop, just traveling, going back. When did it hit you?
I don't even know if it's honestly even hit me. It was so fast in the grand scheme of all the preparation, like the 2 weeks that actually took to climb it, that it didn't feel like it happened at first. And I came back and you wouldn't have known. Like I didn't have, typically when people go and climb Everest, they'll lose like 15, 20 pounds even, like a lot of it muscle mass, right? And they look beat up. They're like, their face is all like burned where their goggles weren't, like raccoon face. I had like a couple of windburn marks on my cheeks and like a little mark on my face from where the mask was rubbing. But other than that, I didn't lose any weight. I didn't lose any muscle. I measured with a DEXA like 2 days later. I looked completely normal. I felt completely normal. I was tired, but like, you wouldn't have known I just climbed Everest. And it was so fast, it felt like it didn't happen. But getting home and my family had driven up from San Diego to surprise me at the airport, and some coworkers came to meet me. It was just like, I'm not a crier, but I definitely had a moment where I just like broke down crying, and I was just like, oh man, I can't believe this has been crazy. And it was just like so much preparation went into it, and to like get back and realize that we made this crazy 14-day thing happen against all odds. Like, honestly, I didn't think it was going to happen, even when I was on the mountain. And then it all came together with 1 hour to spare. Like, I even booked my ticket at base camp that night. And for some reason, I got upgraded to business class. And so I was just like, wow, the universe is working with me, man.
It's a nice business class. That's a big, long international flight. So it's a good welcome home.
Totally.
I mean, it sounds like the recovery was actually pretty quick. But that's astounding. I mean, you're essentially under caloric for long periods of time there, but you felt like recovery, everything in terms of fatigue, injury, you came out spiffy.
Yeah, I mean, relatively unscathed. I was tired, but day 2 after I got back,
nothing sore, just like.
Not even, right? Yeah. And like, we descended 8,000 feet, and you'd think like your quads would be sore from like all of the downhill, and no.
Just even for like a day hike. I mean, that's like a big hike, 8,000 feet.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like a 16-hour day followed by a 13-hour day. And like, I was pretty good. And I like started running again after I got back, maybe 2 days after I got back, and like called my coaches that week and was like, hey, can we start training? And they were like, can you just rest and chill out for a little bit? They're like, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, take off. I couldn't sit still. So yeah, it was impressive how quickly I bounced back. And like, I really just got kind of back into training right after I got back.
I mean, testament to a lot of your discipline, right? I mean, sound like that was you were super fit. Like, it sounded like that wasn't even a taxing. It was mainly just like a mental and a weather risk as opposed to a physical risk.
Well, I think it's also the way we did it too, right? Like spending 2 weeks above 5,000 meters or 17,000 feet versus spending 2 months. Like, your body is just not exposed to everything for as long.
Right.
It's not exposed to hypoxia for so long. You're not exposed to other climbers and their germs. You're not exposed to like foods that may not be prepared as well as they could be. Like, I had many friends on the south side, that same season at the same time. And like, for instance, one of them, he was there for 7 weeks of his, 2-month rotation, getting ready to climb the mountain, and got pneumonia 2 days before at Camp 2, had to be evacuated by helicopter.
Jeez.
And that was it.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, man, doing this faster is just so much better in so many ways. Like your body doesn't break down as much. Like, you're not away from friends and family that long. You don't have to take as much time off of work. Like there's just so many benefits to doing it faster. I'm not saying you have to do it in 2 weeks, but if you can do it in a month, like they're doing with Alpenglow, like, save yourself some.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the 4-minute mile record. You're gonna just like break people's minds. Like this is the new paradigm. Maybe people will follow your path here. Any lessons or takeaways from this journey, from this process, that either you are taking away as you move into future adventures, whether that's with other physical challenges or through day-to-day civilian life, at a company? Any broader lessons you feel like your understanding of yourself, your understanding of how you can push your body, did something change there, or was it just like, okay, this is another checklist off of my bucket list of all the crazy things I'm going to do with my life?
Yeah, I mean, so many things. I think I learned that I'm a lot more resilient than I thought, that I can withstand a lot more, suffering, a lot more deprivation, a lot more everything than I even thought possible. And that, my body is capable of doing pretty amazing things that I wouldn't have thought possible. And so I wanted, always push things further and see maybe where that line is. But, there's always danger in that, right? But
don't go into full madness, right?
Right. So I think that's one takeaway, is that just like, the human body is incredible. And every time you do something where you're like, I don't know if that's possible for me, and then you do it, it's like, well, what else is possible, right? So definitely it drives me to want to, push harder, train more, find other crazy things to be part of, which is there's always something in the works, right?
Yeah.
But from a science perspective, the data I collected with the suit, the Astroskin suit that I wore, we actually did get IRB approval, and I'll be publishing that data, later this fall, hopefully. So working with researchers at Cal State Sacramento, and so I think getting that data and analyzing that data is going to kind of open up new avenues and inform some of my PhD work. So just, diving more deeply into extreme environmental physiology and nutritional interventions, and how, like where that interplay is and how you can kind of optimize the body to withstand some of these environmental stressors like heat or cold or altitude. So that's one of the big takeaways. It's just like a renewed sense of like fascination with it.
I mean, this is also just super cool. I mean, just thinking about folks doing PhD or graduate work, what's the likelihood or what's the opportunity to have your own body be a hypothesis generating tool, right? And it's pretty cool that this could help inform some of your research direction.
Yeah.
And any early preliminary data, I know when we were talking a little bit beforehand that this is like tons of data that you're collecting. Have you had a chance to get any insight or any particular direction that you're most interested in looking at?
Yeah, I think, some of the pulse oximetry data, so looking at like how much oxygen your blood is carrying. Mm-hmm. So I was able to monitor that like continuously in real time from forehead sensor. I'm actually pretty blown away, and I was even comparing it with the fingertip variety that most people will use. Yeah. Seeing the variation in what you're getting from the forehead sensor versus the fingertip sensor, and then just kind of seeing how that changes over activity or over just the course of climbing the mountain, and like what it does at night is pretty interesting data. So I'm curious to see kind of how that fluctuates with each of those different parameters. But right. I think that's one of the more fascinating parts of it. And
of
course,
even like ketone esters or how you fuel, that could be interesting as well in terms of oxygen status, right?
Right. Yeah. See what your nutrition supplement does. But I haven't even looked at the cognitive data that I collected below 23,000 yet, but I'm hoping that'll be some pretty cool stuff too. So like using the esters and just, increasing altitude and things like that. But there's just so much data. Downloading one of these files is taking days. I'm like, oh my God, how are we even going to sort through this? And I have like a couple months to get it ready in time for ACSM. But anyways, I'm excited.
Cool. So as we wrap up here, I know that I always like to ask folks, if you had infinite resources and infinite population, what kind of study would you want to run? And maybe taking that to a little bit tailored to your specific experience, was there any markers or any devices, if it could be completely invented out of nowhere, that you wish you had tracked better on your attempt?
Yeah, wow. Gosh, I wish I could measure just everything possible. But I would love to see kind of what the impact is on the gut microbiome. That was one of the things I had wanted to do for this particular trip.
Take poops on the mountain.
Well, there's that. You can get like cheek swabs and things. But yeah, so that would be fascinating to see how, hypoxic stress changes the gut microbiome. Yeah. I would love to look at some genetic components to adaptation. So looking at like hypoxia inducible factor, being able to look at that and see like if the hypoxic tent system actually affects that at all, because it's not quite the same, right? So the hypoxic tents, it gives you lower oxygen, but it doesn't give you lower pressure, right? So it's not exactly a perfect mimetic of a high altitude scenario. So, there's some controversy over whether they actually work or not. And that's the scary part too, is like, I'm going into this and I'm like, a lot of people think that this is all just, not going to work. And I'm going to get to 17,000 feet and I could just pass out and like, that could be the end of the trip. Yeah. But for previous experience, I kind of had a good idea it would work. But I'd love to be able to see and measure just some like transcription factors to see if the hypoxic tent system touches some of these things that we know altitude affects. So that would be some great data to have. Yeah.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So I know that you mentioned that, well, I guess it's almost time to think about 2020. I guess Antarctica is on that list. I mean, what other adventures are on your radar? And it sounds like Antarctica will be the last continent. What's next after that?
Yep. So, I mean, I've already planned Antarctica because that's just who I am. So I'll be heading down there in December, and I will summit in January 2020. So that'll be my last of the 7 summits. But, along the way with this whole 7 summits on 7 continents thing, I've created other goals, obviously, and been climbing other peaks, just, not on that list. So started doing, the highest volcanoes on each continent. So I'll be doing the highest volcano in Antarctica, also doing the South Pole. I'd like to head up and do the North Pole if I can before it disappears and becomes, unreachable by land, right? You'll be swimming there eventually pretty soon, not too far from now.
Or just have your yacht pull up. Right. All right, done.
Yeah. So there's always something in the works. And, then beyond that, who knows, maybe the 8,000 meter peaks. K2 is the second highest mountain in the world, but by far more dangerous than Everest. Yep. And more difficult. And, I probably would have never even considered that previously, but who knows? I think anything's possible at this point.
Cool. Well, how do we stay track? I mean, do you post updates on social? Anything that we should follow in terms of all your adventures?
Yeah, I'm kind of bad about social media, but I do have an Instagram. So it's at Roxy Mountain Girl, MTN Girl. And so I do post, about adventures and things like that. That's primarily what I use that for. Yeah. Goo Energy, they usually support projects, and so there's always updates about my trips and things. So they even had like a live tracking of this Everest trip, which was pretty cool. Yeah. So gooenergy.com, you can usually find updates about trips and things like that there. And yeah, there will be some exciting news coming out pretty soon about this Antarctica trip. So, stay tuned.
Awesome. Roxanne, really a really fun conversation. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Thanks for tuning in this week, everyone. If you want to learn more about H.V.M.N. and our offerings, visit www.hvmn.com/pod. Also, by writing a review on our iTunes page and sending a screenshot to podcast@hvmn.com, we'll hook you up with $15 worth of H.V.M.N. store credit. Our last shout out goes out to our listener survey, which lets us know who you are better so we can continue making episodes you find most valuable. Visit go.hvmn.com/podcast survey for that survey. It'll only take a few minutes, and new submissions are eligible for an H.V.M.N. ketone giveaway. Until next time, eat well, train smart, and live your life.